The United Nations Mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, is a United Nations peacekeeping mission for South Sudan, which became independent on July 9, 2011. UNMISS was established on July 8, 2011 by United Nations Security Council Resolution 1996, 2011. Almost 20,000 peacekeepers serve with the United Nations mission in South Sudan to protect civilians and build durable peace in the conflict-affected country. The civilian, police and military personnel from 73 countries carry out many duties under the mandate provided by the United Nations Security Council. Their work falls under four main pillars. Protection of civilians. Peacekeepers actively patrol in communities across the country to deter violence and provide a protective presence with a particular focus on areas that displaced people are returning to in the wake of the peace deal. Peacekeepers are also responsible for maintaining safety and security for people living within UNMISS protection of civilian sites, deterring and preventing sexual and gender-based violence where possible, and supporting efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve intercommunal conflict. Another key activity is to work in partnership with humanitarian agencies to support the safe, informed, voluntary and dignified return of displaced families from the POC sites to their homes. Creating conditions conducive to the delivery of humanitarian assistance, UNMISS peacekeepers work to ensure that humanitarian aid, such as food, clean water, shelter, and health care, reaches millions of people in need across South Sudan. The aim is also to provide a safe and supportive environment so that displaced people can return to their homes and communities to live safely and with dignity. Supporting the implementation of the revitalized agreement and the peace process, the mission is committed to helping build durable peace in South Sudan. It does this by working as an impartial partner at the national and subnational level with political, religious, traditional, and community leaders as well as with communities and individuals. UNMISS uses its good offices to support the implementation of the peace agreement through the provision of advice and technical assistance. It also supports the ceasefire and transitional security monitoring and verification mechanism in its work to monitor and report on violations of the ceasefire and assists the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, which is responsible for overseeing the mandate and tasks of the Transitional Government of National Unity and the implementation of the peace agreement. Monitoring and investigating human rights, the mission monitors, investigates, verifies, and reports on violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law, including those that may amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. A particular focus is on abuses against children and women, including all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Incidents of hate speech and incitement to violence are also investigated. Technical support is provided to other local, regional and international organizations carrying out similar work in relation to human rights monitoring and reporting. Since December 2016, UNMISS has been led by the Secretary General's Special Representative, South African lawyer and diplomat Nicholas Haysom. Haysom succeeded David Shearer in January 2021. As of March 2021, it is composed of 14,222 military personnel, 1,446 police, and 2,228 civilian workers, as well as small contingents of experts, staff officers, and volunteers. The military deployment is commanded by the Indian Lieutenant General Mohan Subramanian. It is headquartered in the South Sudanese capital of Juba. The stated UNMISS mandate includes support for peace consolidation and thereby fostering longer-term state building and economic development. Support the government of the Republic of South Sudan in exercising its responsibilities for conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution and protect civilians. Support the government of the Republic of South Sudan in developing its capacity to provide security, to establish rule of law, and to strengthen the security and justice sectors. The mission was established by Security Council Resolution 1996 and extended to July 15, 2013 by Resolution 2057. As per Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, the peacekeeping mission is concerned with the protection of civilians, and thus is not mandated to engage in protection of South Sudan's territory or the sovereignty of that territory, Cf. the 2012 South Sudan border war. In a July 2012 speech, a day after the extension of the mission, Hilda F. Johnson spoke in Juba about the progress of UNMISS. Johnson discussed the mission's protection of civilians and the documenting and verification of incidents. Johnson discussed the January 2012 Lu-Nuer attacks in Jonglei State, whereby the actions of UNMISS in deploying peacekeepers and alerting the South Sudanese government resulted in thousands of civilian lives being saved, as well as progress in areas such as policing, justice and democracy. On December 21, 2012, a civilian UNMISS helicopter was shot down over Jonglei State. All 4 Russian crew members on board the aircraft were killed. 2013. On April 9, 5 Indian UNMISS troops and 7 civilian UN employees, 2 UN staff and 5 contractors, were killed in a rebel ambush in Jonglei while escorting a UN convoy between Piber and Bor. 9 further UN employees, both military and civilian, were wounded and some remain missing. 4 of the civilians killed were Kenyan contractors working to drill water boreholes. One of the dead soldiers was a lieutenant colonel and one of the wounded was a captain. According to South Sudan's military spokesman, the convoy was attacked by David Yaoyao's rebel forces that they believe are supported by the Sudanese government. UNMISS said that 200 armed men were involved in the attack and that their convoy was escorted by 32 Indian Union peacekeepers. The attackers were equipped with rocket-propelled grenades. A UN spokesman said that the fierce resistance put up by Indian peacekeepers forced the rebels to withdraw and saved the lives of many of the civilians. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon called the killings a war crime, and called for the perpetrators to be brought to justice. United Nations Assistant Secretary-General Anthony Banbury praised the bravery of the Indian soldiers. India's Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, paid his tribute to the brave soldiers. About 2,200 Indian Army personnel are deployed in South Sudan as a part of the UNMISS mission. Coup d'état attempt. Fighting that spread as a result of the 2013 South Sudanese coup d'état attempt led to the deaths of 2 Indian peacekeepers, while another soldier was wounded in Akobo, Jonglei, on December 19. On December 24, the UNSC voted to nearly double the existing 7,600 troops in the mission, with another approximately 6,000 troops to be added. The UN Secretary-General expressed deep concern as UN staff received threats from the bodyguards of senior government information minister that demanded armed access to UN mission camps where civilians are sheltering. Following this incident, President Salva Kiir accused the UN of sheltering armed opposition forces in their UN mission, which the UN denied. Salva Kiir also accused the UN of an attempted takeover of his leadership. On Thursday, April 17, 2014, 58 people were killed and at least 100 people wounded when an armed mob stormed the UN base in Bor. A crowd of people who pretended they were visiting the base to present a peaceful petition opened fire on some of the 5,000 civilians who had taken shelter in the UN base. Of those killed, 48 were civilians, while 10 were among the attackers. The violence reflected tension between the ethnic Dinka and Nuer peoples. Before the attack, a crowd of local Dinkas had demanded the thousands of Nuer sheltering in the camp be relocated elsewhere. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon emphasized that any attack on UN peacekeepers constituted a war crime. The UN Security Council expressed outrage at the attack, saying, "The members of the Security Council expressed their outrage at the recent attacks by armed groups in South Sudan that have purposefully targeted civilians as well as UN mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, sites and personnel, in particular April 17 attack against the UNMISS compound in Bor that resulted in scores of dead and injured, including those seeking the shelter and protection of the United Nations, and April 14 attacks in Bentiu and Unity State." The members of the Security Council condemned in the strongest terms these acts and underscored that attacks on civilians and UN peacekeepers may constitute a war crime. In June 2014, Vietnam participated in UNMISS as their first official peacekeeping mission by sending officers from the Vietnam People's Army. As part of its mandate to conduct human rights reporting, UNMISS released a report in mid-2015 on an alleged campaign of violence by the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, and associated armed groups in Unity State. The report cited witness accounts of abductions, rapes, and people being killed and burned alive in dwellings. UNMISS continued to struggle to cope with the large populations of internally displaced people living within the protection of civilians, POC, sites in 2015. The mission was accused in May 2015 of failing to secure the perimeter of the Bentiu POC site during an expansion of the site led by the International Organization for Migration. Ban Ki-moon requested an independent investigation of the deployment be made following reports that on July 11 South Sudanese troops rampaged through the capital, killing and raping civilians and foreign aid workers. The event had occurred following 3 days of fighting between troops loyal to President Salva Kiir and soldiers aligned with former Vice President Riek Machar that resulted in the deaths of 300 civilians and 2 Union peacekeepers. Led by Patrick Camard, the investigation found that the force suffered from disorganization and a lack of leadership. Ban Ki-moon requested on November 1 that Lieutenant General Johnson Magoha Kimani Ondiki, the Kenyan force commander, be replaced as soon as possible. The next day the Kenyan Ministry of Foreign Affairs accused the United Nations of using Ondiki as a scapegoat and announced that it would be withdrawing all of its forces from South Sudan. Head of UNMISS, Ellen Margrethe Loy, completed her assignment in November 2016 and was replaced by David Shearer. In 2016, the United Kingdom began Operation Trenton, a deployment of over 300 personnel to support UNMISS. It concluded in 2020. Japanese peacekeepers left South Sudan, ending 5 years of their mandate under UNMISS. The withdrawals were done in April 2017, followed by 2 withdrawals in May with Chief Cabinet Shuga denying that it was made due to security matters. Their deployment was a part of the Abe government's efforts to promote new laws for Japanese peacekeepers to easily intervene, such as assisting fellow peacekeepers and civilians working under UNMISS Mandate. The Japanese MOD is accusing of covering up the security situation in Juba. In December 2017, the mission closed down the first Protection of Civilian Site, POC, in Malutown after IDPs voluntarily requested to return home. On January 15, 2021, the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres announced Haysam's appointment as his special representative and head of the United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS. As stated, the UNMISS has been present in the country since its independence in 2011. However, as demonstrated throughout the mission's history, there were numerous incidents that point towards an inability of the peacekeeping forces to protect civilians. In general, scholars such as Weinstein question the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions, and it is not difficult to find a peacekeeping fiasco among the numerous peacekeeping missions undertaken within the history of the United Nations. While it is only possible to speculate on counterfactuals for the assessment and evaluation of peacekeeping missions and their effectiveness, i.e. we do not know what the situation in South Sudan would look like if the UN had not deployed peacekeeping forces, an article published in the New York Times has called for an alternative international intervention for South Sudan. Thereby, the alternatives for international interventions are numerous. The article mentions trusteeship as a potential solution to the violent chaos in South Sudan. This form of international intervention was prominently discussed by Fearon and Layatin. The authors thereby suggest a system of neo-trusteeship, in which peacekeeping efforts should be oriented towards state building under the coordination of a leading, outside, state. This state building should encompass the establishment of institutions that are necessary for increasing South Sudan's capability for collecting taxes, which could increase the governance capacity of the country. To prevent a new civil war in South Sudan, according to Fearon and Layatin's neo-trusteeship approach, a continuous international monitoring and support system might be required. The New York Times article states that some South Sudanese would not tolerate such an international trusteeship and might see it as colonialism. Furthermore, as pointed out by Weinstein, neo-trusteeship is a post-conflict international intervention. As South Sudan was still in the midst of a bloody conflict as of 2005, Weinstein suggested refraining from any kind of international intervention and leaving the South Sudanese to solve their conflict autonomously, autonomous recovery, usually through the victory of one of the conflict parties over the other. Thank you for watching this video.